Coming up, why Americans are seduced by war.
Oblivious to the implications of creeping militarism, Americans have for the most part accepted it. Indeed, in unexpected quarters have embraced it.
Boston University professor and former Army officer Andrew Bacevich discusses the troubling effects of the military's outsized influence on the U.S. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
I'd like to thank you all for joining us as we welcome back a very special guest, Andrew Bacevich. As perhaps one of the leading critics of America's preoccupation with military powers, he is known as much for his independence of thought as for his insistence on grounding his public remarks with a clear sense of moral principle and purpose. Speaking out about what one truly believes in confers its own moral authority. And when that person is discussing our military and just so happens to be a West Point alumnus, a Vietnam vet, an academic, and an author of several widely acclaimed books, I believe we should heed his advice.
Somewhere right around the end of the Cold War, Americans said yes to military power. If you wanted to pick a specific moment, that moment might be in early 1991, back when Operation Desert Storm ended in what appeared to be a historic victory. Right then, the skepticism about arms and armies that had informed the American experiment from its founding vanished. Political leaders became enamored with military might. And American military leaders, who ought to have known better, became complicit in marketing alluring visions of future warfare that had no basis in history and that events soon revealed as fraudulent. The ensuing affair has been a passion pursued in utter disregard of the consequences that have ensued. Few of those wielding authority in Washington or influencing opinion in the mainstream media have critically evaluated the implications of valuing military power for its own sake. Fewer still have considered the possibility that cultivating permanent global military superiority might be at odds both with American principles and American interests. How does this new American militarism, defined here as outsized expectations regarding the efficacy of force, a tendency to see military power as the truest manifestation of national greatness, and a romanticized view of soldiers, how does this new American militarism manifest itself? Well, it does so, first of all, in the scope, cost, and configuration of America's present-day military establishment. Through the first 2 centuries of U.S. history, political leaders in Washington gauged the size and capabilities of America's armed forces according to the security tasks immediately at hand. A grave and proximate threat to the nation's well-being might require a large and powerful military establishment. In the absence of such a threat, however, policymakers scaled down that establishment accordingly. With the passing of crisis, the Army raised up for the crisis went immediately out of existence. This had been the case in 1865, in 1918, and indeed in 1945. The general principle was to maintain a minimum force required and no more. Since the end of the Cold War, however, having become to value military power for its own sake, the United States has abandoned this principle and is committed as a matter of policy to maintaining military capabilities far in excess of those of any would-be adversary or combination of adversaries. This commitment finds both qualitative and quantitative expression, with U.S. armed forces dwarfing that of even America's closest ally. Thus, whereas the United States Navy maintains a dozen very large attack aircraft carriers, the once vaunted Royal Navy has none. Indeed, in all the battle fleets of the world, there is no ship even remotely comparable to a Nimitz-class carrier. Today, the United States Marine Corps possesses more attack aircraft than does the entire Royal Air Force. And the United States has 2 other even larger air forces, one an integral part of the Navy, and the other officially designated as the United States Air Force. Indeed, in terms of numbers of men and women in uniform, the United States Marine Corps is half again as large as the entire British Army. And the Pentagon has a second, even larger army, actually called the United States Army, which in turn operates its own air force of several thousand aircraft. All of these massive and redundant capabilities cost money. Prior to 9/11, American military spending exceeded by a factor of 25 the combined military budgets of the 7 so-called rogue states then comprising the roster of U.S. enemies. Indeed, by some calculations, the United States was then spending more on its armed forces than every other nation in the world combined. This was a circumstance without historical precedent. The effect of 9/11 was to increase military spending by leaps and bounds. In constant dollars, Pentagon spending today is considerably higher than it was at any time during the Cold War. That is to say, back when we worried about having to fight the communist hordes. More astonishingly still, after the war in Afghanistan ends, projected Pentagon spending will remain at levels higher than they ever reached during the Cold War. On a day-to-day basis, what do these expensive forces exist to do? For the Department of Defense, defense, per se, figures as little more than an afterthought. The primary mission of America's far-flung military establishment is global power projection, tacitly understood in all quarters of American society. That well over a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States continues to maintain bases and forces in several dozen countries, by some counts over 100 in all, rouses minimal controversy, despite the fact that many of these countries are perfectly capable of providing for their own security needs. That even apart from fighting wars and pursuing terrorists, U.S. forces, these days augmented by CIA paramilitaries, are constantly prowling the globe, training, exercising, planning, posturing, and liquidating whoever the White House has decided to liquidate, elicits no more notice from the average American than the presence of a cop on a city street corner. Even before the Pentagon officially assigned itself the mission of shaping the international environment, members of the political elite, liberals and conservatives alike, had reached a common understanding that scattering U.S. troops around the globe to restrain, inspire, influence, persuade, or cajole paid dividends. The new American militarism also manifests itself through an increased propensity to use force, leading in effect to the normalization of war. As a consequence, self-restraint regarding the use of force has all but disappeared. Whereas during the entire Cold War era, large-scale U.S. military actions abroad totaled a scant 6 in all. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, war has become almost an annual event. The brief period extending from 1989's Operation Just Cause, remember the invasion of Panama, to Operation Iraqi Freedom, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2003, featured 9 major military interventions. And that does not count innumerable lesser actions such as Bill Clinton's signature cruise missile attacks, the almost daily bombing of Iraq during the late 1990s, or the quasi-combat missions that have seen GIs dispatched to Rwanda, Colombia, East Timor, the Philippines, Pakistan, Libya, and most recently to various countries in sub-Saharan Africa as AFRICOM expands its mandate. As crisis became a seemingly permanent condition, so too did war. The George W. Bush administration tacitly acknowledged as much in describing its global campaign against terror as a conflict likely to last decades, and in also promulgating a doctrine of preventive war. The Obama administration has abandoned the phrase. We no longer hear of talk of the GWAD. But it has sustained the expectation of open-ended conflict. Iraq war has ended. The Afghanistan war is winding down. But the violent pursuit of violent Islamists continues with no end in sight. Reinforcing this heightened predilection for arms was the appearance during the 1990s of a new aesthetic of war. This was a third indication of advancing militarism. The old 20th century aesthetic, the one most of you are familiar with, depicted war as barbarism, brutality, ugliness, and sheer waste, an aesthetic that I think mostly grew out of World War I, as depicted by writers like Ernest Hemingway and Robert Graves. But World War II and Korea and certainly Vietnam affirmed that aesthetic. In the latter case, films like Apocalypse Now and Platoon and Full Metal Jacket. But by the turn of the 21st century, a new image of war had emerged. According to many observers, the era of mass armies and mechanized warfare destruction had ended. A new era of high-tech warfare, waged by highly skilled professionals equipped with smart weapons, had commenced. So we were told. Describing the result inspired a new lexicon of military terms. War was becoming surgical, frictionless, postmodern, even abstract or virtual. It was now coercive diplomacy, the object of the exercise no longer to kill, but to persuade. In war as spectacle, force had acquired symbolic value. The aim was no longer anything so crude as laying waste to the enemy. Merely demonstrating that one possessed the ability to do so was expected to suffice. To use force was to strike a posture, to manipulate perceptions, or to send a message. In short, by the dawn of the 21st century, the reigning postulates of technology as panacea had knocked away much of the accumulated blood rust sullying war's reputation. Thus reimagined, armed conflict regained an aesthetic respectability that the literary and artistic interpreters of 20th century military cataclysms were thought to have demolished once and for all. In the right circumstances, for the right cause, it now turned out war could actually offer an attractive option, cost-effective, humane, even thrilling. Well, this new aesthetic made it as far as Baghdad in the spring of 2003, and that was about it. The war inaugurated with expectations of shock and awe, delivering a clean, quick victory, turned out to be not all that different from every other war worthy of the name, ugly and dehumanizing. Well, what lessons did Americans take from all that our troops suffered and afflicted on others in Iraq? That war was irredeemably a brutal and risky proposition? Not at all. We persuaded ourselves instead that missile-firing drones and skilled commandos could soften the brutality and mitigate the risk. But this new aesthetic contributed in turn to an appreciable boost in the status of military institutions and soldiers themselves, the fourth manifestation of a new American militarism. Since the end of the Cold War, opinion polls surveying public attitudes toward national institutions have regularly ranked the armed forces first. Americans fearful that the rest of society may be teetering on the brink of moral collapse console themselves with the thought that the armed forces remain a repository of traditional virtues, old-fashioned values, and competence. Confidence in the military has found expression in a tendency to elevate the soldier to the status of national icon, the apotheosis of all that is great and good about contemporary America. As a consequence, in public life today, paying homage to those in uniform has become obligatory. The one unforgivable sin in American politics is to be found guilty of failing to support the troops. Even among left liberal activists, the reflexes of anti-militarism of the 1960s has given way to a more nuanced view. Progressives have come to appreciate the potential for using the armed forces to advance their own agenda. Thus, the most persistent calls for U.S. intervention abroad to relieve the plight of the abused and persecuted, did somebody say Syria, come from the left. Oblivious to the implications of creeping militarism, Americans have for the most part accepted it. Indeed, in unexpected quarters have embraced it with an enthusiasm that is nothing short of inexplicable. If only by default, the nation's status as the greatest military power the world has ever seen has come to signify a cosmic verdict of sorts, a compelling affirmation of American exceptionalism. In fact, I believe, our present-day military ascendancy represents something quite different. For all this, seeing the armed forces as the preeminent expression of state power and military institutions as the chief repositories of civic virtue, all of this distorts, if it does not altogether forfeit, important elements of the American birthright. Recall that at the outset, the New World, still a phrase that was used when I was going to grade school, the New World was intended to be radically and profoundly new. The vision of freedom animating the founders of 17th century Anglo-America, of the 18th century American Republic, distinguished their purpose from that of the Old World, which was constantly embroiled in bloody disputes over privilege and power. Princes, armies, and perpetual war defined Europe. The absence of these things was to provide a point of departure for defining America. Determined to preserve their freedom and their experiment in popular self-government, Americans knew instinctively that militarism numbered as perhaps the foremost threat to their prospect of doing so. Military power was poison, one not without its occasional utility, but poison all the same, and never to be regarded otherwise. In our time, oblivious to the potential consequences, we have lost sight of that truth. We have chosen to marry the means of the old world to the ends of the new, relying on force and the threat of force to spread the American way of life, or as my favorite writer Max Boot has observed, quote, imposing the rule of law, property rights, and other guarantees at gunpoint, if need be, end of quote. Thus has the condition that worried C. Wright Mills back in 1956 come to pass in our own day. Whereas in earlier times, he wrote, Americans viewed history as, quote, a peaceful continuum interrupted by war. Today, planning, preparing, and waging war has become, quote, the normal state and seemingly permanent condition of the United States. And as Mills observed, again quoting, the only accepted plan for peace is the loaded pistol. Thank you very much.
How can diplomacy fight back? I mean, the State Department has lost the war right now in Washington to the Pentagon and the CIA. Do you see, is that where one begins to get the initiative back?
I rather think that the place to begin is with history and our understanding of the history of the 20th century in particular, and maybe more broadly, our place in history. What do I mean by that? I think as a people, we have absorbed a historical narrative that really transforms history into a morality tale. A morality tale in which either God or Providence has assigned to the United States a role in which we are called upon to bring history to some predesignated conclusion. We have come to believe that that endpoint of history will be a moment when everybody else catches up to us and embraces our values, which we have insisted for decades, at least going back to Woodrow Wilson, our values as necessarily universal values. If you come at the events of the world from that perspective, diplomacy is not all that useful. Because if you come at it from that perspective, there really is precious little to negotiate. There is, in fact, a verdict that needs to be rendered, and those who resist that have to be dealt with, and military power seems to be the instrument for doing so. Now, if you take a different perspective on history, let's posit that the definitive event in the 20th century was not World War II, the Anglo-American War against Nazi Germany. Let's posit that the central event of the 20th century was the British decision to dismantle the Ottoman Empire during World War I. So let's imagine that the history we want to learn from, to embrace, is the story of all that happens after the Brits decide to turn against the Ottomans and to create a new Middle East. That's an ugly story. It's not a story in which the Brits are the good guys. It's not a story in which we would celebrate the role of Winston Churchill. But it is a story, in fact, that it seems to me has a far greater explanatory value than even World War II as the Anglo-American War against Nazi Germany, in helping us understand the set of circumstances and problems that we face at the present moment. It's not a good guys against bad guys story. It's certainly not it's not a story in which Western democracies, the Brits and then the United States as the successors to the Brits in the greater Middle East. It's not a story in which our behavior has been motivated by a desire to do good things to others. And if you take that story as the instructive story, then it seems to me you can come to a point where you'd say, maybe instead of imagining that we are called upon to enforce our will and impose our values, maybe there's some things that really ought to be discussed and negotiated, and that would open up a space where diplomacy could be more effective. Let's take the case of Iran specifically, where U.S. and British policy has been mischievous, to be kind, going back to the overthrow of the Mossadegh regime in 1953. I find it somewhat understandable that an Iranian government might find value in acquiring nuclear weapons. I find it somewhat understandable that an Iranian government, however objectionable in many ways, might view itself as surrounded and threatened above all by my country, the United States of America. So to my mind, the militarists, who tend to be the loudest voices in our politics, who, of course, many of whom promote the idea, who tell us that containment is unacceptable, who tell us that we need to strike now against the Iranians to prevent them from acquiring the nuclear weapons, if that's indeed what they're doing. Discrediting their argument becomes possible if we appreciate the extent to which, from an Iranian perspective, it's a somewhat different story.
How would you rate the threat to the United States or the West from al-Qaeda, the Taliban? So much of our military effort today seems to be devoted to try to stem this, this tide.
I would rate the threat as real but modest. My telling of the tale of why 9/11 occurred would be because we chose not to defend ourselves. We failed. The institutions of government at the federal, state, and local level failed to put in place reasonable efforts to prevent 19 thugs with box cutters from hijacking airplanes and running them into buildings. I prefer, it's not me, I'm not the first one to say this, I would think it much preferable for us to define al-Qaeda as, in essence, a version of the mafia. It's an international criminal gang, and that the appropriate response is not to undertake war, but to mobilize an international police effort to identify and dismantle this enterprise. And I've been trying to get a graduate student for some considerable time now to write a history of the Carter Doctrine and its consequences. You all remember the Carter Doctrine, President Carter's State of the Union address, January 1980, in which he declared that the Persian Gulf was a vital national security interest, said that the United States would use all means necessary in order to ensure that hostile powers would not control the Persian Gulf. President Carter did that in response to the overthrow of the Shah and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. He also did it in part because he was deeply unpopular, facing a re-election campaign, and needed to do something to try to burnish his national security credentials. I don't think that he had any real appreciation for the process that he was inadvertently setting in motion. And I would describe that process this way. From January 1980 down to the present moment, the United States began an attempt on an ever wider geographic scale to use American hard power to bring stability to this region of the world. So, accept that definition of what we've been trying to do since 1980. In other words, use that as the context in which to understand the Gulf War of 1990-91, well, even before that, the Reagan tanker war of the 1980s, the Operation Desert Storm, the dual containment policy, the interventions on the fringes in places like Afghanistan or Somalia, the post-9/11 wars. Take all those events and imagine that they are part of a campaign, not necessarily a coherent campaign, not completely well thought out, but an effort on the part of the United States to use our power to bring stability to this important part of the world. We're here in 2013. How are we doing? People may differ. My judgment would be that it's not going well. That we have, in fact, expended enormous resources. And on the evidence, that part of the world is becoming less stable, not more stable. Now, we can have an argument about whether we are causing the instability or whether or not our efforts, in a sense, are irrelevant, but instability is the reality. Does it not make sense to step back and say, maybe we ought to try a different approach? That simply trying harder, and I take the expansion of the AFRICOM mandate and the growing U.S. military presence sort of creeping down into sub-Saharan Africa as a further continuation, further expansion of this project. It ain't working, and we need to try something different. And I'm not trying to suggest to you that, I have here in my little notes the three bullets which will, lead to success, but I think it is time for us to recognize whatever our problems are in the greater Middle East, military power is not going to solve them.
In the words of Uncle Sam, we need you to continue the conversation. Thank you so much. It was terrific.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.